Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 230, Sherman and Meade. Last episode, we went through more ghost stories listed in newspapers at the time of the war. I find these entertaining and also enlightening to the interest in mysticism back in the 1800s. I'm only asked to look at a ghost show today to connect with those people from the past. I think there's a good connection there. This week, we head back to our analysis series, this time taking a look at two prominent Union generals. Before we do that, though, we do need to talk about some Patreon content, and of course, we have an episode posted this month coming out. It should be a memoir review, and in this installment of our memoirs, we're actually going to be looking at a scout in the Union Army, somebody who was not only with the cavalry, but mapping out the approaches of the Union forces, right? Finding out where the Confederates were, things of that nature. We've done a couple of these memoirs, and we've had a good variety, I think, of individuals, whether it's regular army, infantry, right, artillery, cavalry, even some partisan rangers, right? But now we are going to a scout here, so something a little bit different. So if that sounds like it would interest you, I just listed off a whole bunch of other memoir reviews that we've done for other individuals. We do movie reviews as well. We recently did Emancipation, which is a recent film, or at least a more recent film at the time of this recording, about the Civil War. And we also have picture slideshows. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So we have gone through some analysis episodes where we have covered Lee, Jackson, Grant, and McClellan so far. Each of them received their own service, and now we need to maybe branch out and see about running down a few more key figures. Today we have two names to give the breakdown for, two key subordinates for Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, and George G. Meade. Now I think we can continue to go down the rabbit hole of key figures in the war, and there are probably a good handful more that really helped in the Union war effort to propel them to victory. Remember a while back I referred to this as a kind of pillar set up to the house that was the war machine and of course the eventual victory. Two key candidates that I believe deserve to be there, along with the likes of others, maybe some fringe individuals like we will cover in future episodes like George Thomas and Phil Sheridan, but certainly the two individuals that we have today probably deserve to be on there. Now Sherman is an obvious choice, right? He is the chief lieutenant to Grant. They form a kind of Lee-Jackson relationship that carries them all the way to the end. The only real difference in my mind is that Sherman is really given carte blanche to act as his own commander, whereas Jackson does not. In fact, I would throw out there that Jackson would behave much in the same way as Sherman does in the South. Jackson, of course, as we have discussed, has a big idea of waging more total war upon the people of the North in an effort to get them to submit. Sherman, as we have already discussed, is going to be very much on that kind of train of thought. Another real difference, though, between the two, if we're going to make the Jackson comparison to Sherman, is that Jackson is more of a subordinate in terms of a field command and more of a battlefield presence. So while he is an expert in terms of campaign, he does display that several times, how he has a good aptitude for that. As mentioned, he doesn't act independently, whereas Sherman does act independently, but he's serving less in the terms of being this battlefield presence that Jackson is in the East, right? He's kind of operating under this overall sort of plan of Robert E. Lee, and Lee is giving him trust to do what he wants him to do. And Sherman is going to have that trust, but you're going to see it less in terms of being in actual combat. As such, I think Sherman's contribution is a little bit more complicated when it comes to the overall end-of-war strategy. While the Lee-Jackson comparison is apt, I would say that Sherman is more on the same page with Grant in what it takes to win the war rather than on the battlefield. I'm not sure I'm speaking out of school when I say that I would prefer the Confederate combination on the battlefield versus Sherman and Grant, maybe in terms of your overall strategy, maybe in terms of just campaign just in general, right? But it is important to have the right subordinates, which I believe is the true significance here. On the flip side of that, we have another interesting figure in George Gordon Meade, and maybe also apt in considering the right subordinate. Maybe it applies to him, maybe it doesn't, right? We're about to find out. He would be the last commander of the Army of the Potomac and a long string of general officers who would otherwise fail to capture the attention of the president. Meade has a decent combat record and gets what is considered to be the biggest win of the war at Gettysburg, something neither Sherman nor Grant, for that matter, can really say. They don't have as much of a combat record and do not defeat the best army of the war in a pretty much equal fight. Even more impressive is the fact that Meade only had recently taken over the reins of the army at the time. If you remove Lee's second invasion from the equation, though, Meade has a checkered stint as army leader. He fails to capitalize, and in Virginia, he likewise falters. Remember, there is a lot of factors that are going against him. A lot of people kind of point to the fact that Meade was kind of at a disadvantage after Gettysburg. He's not really in a good position, maybe the best position, to actually pursue Lee's army and make sure that it doesn't get back into Southern soil, just in the war, essentially, in Maryland. Certainly, Abraham Lincoln thinks so, but obviously, it's kind of up to debate. I've seen both sides that are either critical or they're a little bit more lenient of Meade. But you can say that he does not have any huge negatives or setbacks in his tenure, and as I have postulated before, sometimes that's all you need to ask in your Civil War general. In that point, I would like to throw out that Sherman and Meade are considered to be probably different. I've seen it argued that one or the other is preferable for certain reasons. But I would actually throw out there that if we're going to give them a score, if you will, then I think they're going to be a little bit more similar in terms of that number than maybe meets the eye. Sherman is going to have a tough early life. His father was a Supreme Court justice in his home state of Ohio, but he's going to die in 1829 when William T. was only 9 years old. As mentioned in some of our narrative episodes, Sherman is going to be raised by Thomas Ewing, a family friend. Not only was his adopted brother also a general in the Civil War, but William would marry Ellen, his adoptive sister, in 1850. I have seen in some cases where it is argued that the name Tecumseh was actually William's first name, but when baptized Catholic, this was unacceptable. It is usually a good example of the mentality of the noble Native American and a weird sense of fascination prior to the Civil War in America with this sort of time period. Cump would be the nickname given to Sherman as a result of this name. Thomas Ewing would use political connections to get William into West Point. There, Sherman would graduate and serve in Florida during the Seminole Wars, but he would not see any action during the war with Mexico. He would, though, serve in California for a time, where he would make connections with Edward Ord and Henry Halleck. Sherman would be involved in the expedition that's going to start the 1849 gold rush. So, if you're listening in the fine city of San Francisco, you have Sherman to partially thank, probably, for the nickname 49ers. Sherman would move to St. Louis before resigning his commission. From there, he would experience failure in his personal life. He would try his hand in banking and have that fail, spending some time in California. Eventually, he would work for his adopted brothers in their law office, but he's not going to be an effective lawyer either. Prior to the outbreak of hostilities, Cump would find himself as superintendent of a military school. This is where Sherman would have some of his connection to the South. Especially if you consider that this opportunity helped to have him see some success, you can understand his tough decision of who to support when the war actually does start. We have a quote reported to be from Sherman that highlights his conflicting view on the Civil War. "You people of the South don't know what you're doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war, you don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake the people of the North. They are a peaceable people, but an earnest people, and they will fight too. They are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, a railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. You're rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right at your doors. You are bound to fail. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared, with a bad cause to start with. At first you will make headway, but as your limited resources begin to fail, shut out from the markets of Europe as you will be, your cause will begin to wane. If your people will but stop and think, they must see in the end that you will surely fail. William T. was ordered to turn over the contents of the arsenal to the Louisiana state government upon secession. He would resign from his position and then seek to offer his services for the North. Now again, there are a lot of people that point to the quote that we just read as the more complex nature to William Tecumseh Sherman. There's a lot of people that kind of consider him to be sort of maybe lacking when it comes to the strategic sense of awareness, and maybe kind of have this perception of him as not being particularly like smart, right? And I don't necessarily know exactly where that comes from, but certainly it is going to be a tough decision for him, and he does outline very well in the quote exactly what the problem is. The problem is that the North is going to be more able to wage this kind of war, especially if it lasts a long time. They're going to be able to kind of wait out the South, and eventually they're going to win. So it seemed pretty cut and dry to him, and maybe that does influence his decision a little bit, but he does actually have a lot of friends before the war that are going to be Confederate generals. Notably, Braxton Bragg is going to be a good friend of his before the war, because he is actually at what will become Louisiana State University, and Braxton Bragg had actually found himself living in Louisiana prior to the outbreak of the war, so they are actually pretty good friends. Meade was born in Cadiz, Spain in 1815. His father had been a naval agent in that country, but was ruined due to his support of Spain in their portion of the Napoleonic War. George would spend his early years in Philadelphia, and much like Sherman, would lose his father at an early age before attending the U.S. Military Academy. Assigned to artillery, Meade would eventually gain a position in the topographical engineers. Interestingly, George had been less than receptive to the military lifestyle and racked up a large amount of demerits at West Point, but he was very bright. The topographical engineers were usually considered to be the cream of the crop when it came to young officers. Remember that West Point had been a lot of math, and many pre-war backgrounds include some of the sort of engineering as part of their story. Meade would be assigned to the staffs of Zachary Taylor and Robert Patterson. At one point while serving under Worth, he would lead an infantry assault, earning him some praise. Post-Mexican-American War, Meade would spend some time in Florida against the Seminoles and embark on several engineering projects, including the building of several lighthouses in the Sunshine State. In 1861, Sherman would spend some time in St. Louis prior to joining up, where he would witness the Camp Jackson affair. He would be appointed colonel of the 13th U.S. Infantry, and then find himself as a brigade commander in Irvin McDowell's army that would hopefully be crushing the rebellion. Now, Sherman would not perform poorly on the day that would see a complex plan that would not be successful in terms of First Manassas, but he also did not really serve in the best interest of the army, being kind of limited in terms of his tactical understanding. He doesn't deploy his brigade all at once, but simply one regiment at a time, whereas in a situation probably later in the war, if he actually had been a brigade commander and he had marched his entire brigade into combat, there probably would have been more success. Elements of the regulars and some of Sherman's command would have an orderly retreat, leaving the field, which is something that not all Union troops could say. Now, Sherman would find volunteer troops to be less than ideal, something that many officers during the war would speculate. However, the volunteer troops were really what they were going to have. We see McClellan wanting to really train up his command before putting them in the field. Well, Kump would have the same opinion, and especially would think that way as he takes over in Louisville. I think that there is a fallout from First Manassas that we have previously stated, where especially those who were there are reticent to duplicate the result. Part of that is not moving before you're ready, or when your troops are ready. So we have these inflated and probably politically charged accusations that Sherman was calling for huge numbers of troops, as he was afraid that the Confederates are going to roll him in Kentucky. Part of this is going to be actually an accurate assumption that controlling the irregular warfare would indeed result in a large amount of troops contributing to the support system. But when the papers ran with the story, it definitely made Sherman seem incompetent. Luckily for Kump, he had a major ally in Henry Halleck. Remember Halleck having been involved with him in California. Sherman would be removed, but he was going to be allowed to join Halleck and his department in Missouri by the end of the year. I've seen sources vary as to the degree of Sherman's breakdown. Was it really a sort of panic attack, or was he just going to get railroaded by the newspapers? I think both things can be true, where in Kentucky it might seem like the situation was not quite so dire. You can probably understand that in terms of a logistical network, what we see later in the war for these invading Union armies is probably around the troop strength that Sherman is going to call for. He needs a lot of men if he's going to be able to hold the state, not only that, and then act offensively. So he's not necessarily wrong about that. However, you can also understand from the sense of it not being necessarily the main theater of the war. You can see that maybe there are those in Washington that would say, well, this guy's kind of off his rocker, as many start to kind of point fingers at him for. In 1861, Meade would be appointed a brigadier general of volunteers and serve with the Pennsylvania Reserves. Now, it's been a while since we talked about the Pennsylvania Reserves, but this was a division of troops that would be assigned to Virginia during the Peninsula. They would be part of the limited reinforcements that would be sent to McClellan from McDowell's holding force. From there, they would be assigned to Fitzjohn Porter and the 5th Corps. Meade and his troops would see limited action during the first days of the 7 Days battles, but would be heavily engaged at the Battle of Glendale. These actions would see George McCall captured and Meade injured in the fighting. Now, Glendale is one battle which I think I want to go back and redo in more depth in a future episode, but Meade's brigade and McCall's division in particular was in a real precarious position, facing a direct Confederate assault during the battle. If you remember, this was a key crossroads, capture of which might have cut off the Army of the Potomac of escape on the peninsula. Certainly, they would not have been able to get to Malvern Hill being the final battle in the 7 days that's really going to shut the door on Robert E. Lee's ability to capture and destroy the Union Army. So, in some ways, this is going to be sort of the last chance, maybe even the best chance for the Confederates to do that. Meade would return to serve at 2nd Manassas, where he would form part of the defense of Pope's army around Henry House Hill. Prior to Antietam, Meade would replace John Fulton Reynolds in division command. Now, Meade would have a complicated relationship with Reynolds, and Reynolds might be a good subject for a future episode. Some of the praise that he would receive probably should have been Meade's star to rise, but Reynolds would be ahead of him in these early battles. Now, whether Reynolds actually does anything to get to the point that he gets to, that is really the question. I've seen actually both sides that say, like, John Fulton Reynolds would have been a good choice to lead the Army of the Potomac, but for all these battles that we've done, and we've redone some of them as well, the amount of times that you actually say his name during the kind of rundown of the battle, it doesn't really add up, does it? Right? And it's hard to tell, if he would have been a good army leader or not, but just the fact that he gets all the way to that point where he's actually considered to be one of the favorites in terms of taking over the Army of the Potomac, and then he declines, and then Meade is able to kind of be, if we're moving down the list, he's going to be the next guy to then take over, right? It's going to be very fortuitous for Meade. It's going to be very unfortunate for Reynolds, because then he's going to be placing himself in this situation where he's actually going to be mortally wounded on the first day at Gettysburg. At Antietam, though, you're going to see Meade rise all the way to Corps Command. Actually, in the northern part of the battle, you're going to see Reynolds wounded, and you're going to actually see Hooker wounded as well. So both those guys are going to be taken out of the equation, and then Meade's going to take over. And really, there's not going to be a whole lot that he's going to necessarily do, but he does a good job in holding down the sector. At the end of the year, Meade would find himself under William Franklin, and in the Prospect Hill region of the Battle of Fredericksburg, he's going to be probably turning in one of his better performances. Part of his command would smash into Gregg's South Carolinians in the weak spot on Jackson's line. They would almost cause some havoc in this area before the Confederates were able to respond. Indeed, actually, this probably is the best opportunity for the Union Army to win at the Battle of Fredericksburg. We've talked about this before, where it is in this region where they might have been able to make something work. It's a plan that is misguided, really, and should have been called off maybe sooner if we're really thinking critically. And we'll talk about Burnside in one of these episodes in the future, but it is certainly a spot where if there was going to be some sort of success, it would have been right here. In 1862, a reinstated Sherman would find himself under Grant as the combined Union forces struck south following their captures of Forts Henry and Donelson. It would be his command which would find itself at Pittsburgh Landing and the victim of the initial Confederate assaults on the Union camps to kick off the Battle of Shiloh. Now, Shiloh might be a battle we go back and redo, but needless to say, we have a lot of blame that's going to be able to be passed out. Sherman does not dig in, but then again, there is an overwhelming feeling that the Confederates are sort of done, and the war might just be coming to a close sooner rather than later. Grant has some sort of blame for not being with the army, but also he was trying to coordinate the additions of Don Carlos Buell's command, so it's justified in some sense. Sherman is wounded in the hand during the action, regardless of who deserves the blame for the surprise that the rebels unleash. Enough effort is made to shore up the Union lines and make a stand around the landing itself. Famously, Grant and Sherman have their conference after the first day and solidify their partnership. Shiloh will become a huge victory, Sherman moving on to continue in the Corinth campaign, a triumph for Halleck, who fortunately for Grant is actually promoted to go to Washington. Now, we can also point out here that Sherman is very unique in the sense that, you know, his wagon is sort of hitched to Henry Halleck, old brains here at the beginning of the war, right? That's kind of his benefactor, his guy. But then we have Grant kind of coming onto the scene, and it would have been pretty easy for Sherman to sort of throw Grant under the bus, right? Like, he had this setback in Kentucky. He is considered to be this crazy guy, right? And then we have Shiloh, and despite it being a Union victory, there are people who are kind of going to point fingers. You know, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it that the Union Army almost lost? They could have very well have lost, I believe, on the first day. Although, you know, once it gets into the second day, it's probably going to be a situation where the Confederates probably weren't going to be able to win that one, even if PGT Beauregard had continued to attack in the late evening. So at a certain point, you know, the scale sort of tips, in my opinion. But then you have all these people who are like, you know, whose fault is it? You know, that the army was surprised. Number one, nobody dug in, and that's kind of a big one, you know. And you could have very easily, if you were Sherman, pointed fingers at Grant, and in many ways that probably would have actually endeared him more to Henry Halleck, who Halleck is not liking the praise that Grant's going to get. He's not liking the fame that he has now, because he has Forts Henry and Donelson under his belt, and then Shiloh. You know, right or wrong, you probably could actually point to Don Carlos Buell and his additional troops that arrive as really what tips the scale. It doesn't really take a tactical master to figure that one out, where you have essentially a fresh army that shows up. So certainly Sherman would have been able to maybe advance his career in that fashion, but he doesn't do it. So there is something to be said for him for that. 1862 will end with Sherman joining in on the attempts for Vicksburg. As such, we have his assault at Chickasaw Bayou. Now, you can maybe forgive Sherman for thinking that the Confederates were not ready to defend this area. If you recall, this is an early attempt on the Confederate Gibraltar, with Grant moving overland and hopefully drawing some attention away from the city. Sherman and his command probably had a good chance of maybe getting at Vicksburg, but there is an effort from Earl Van Dorn to stop Grant with a cavalry raid thus freeing up some troops to trick back to defend against the riverborne threat. What I find perplexing, though, is that Grant just decides to attack head-on. Even with a numerical advantage, this would seem to be less than inspired thinking by Sherman. Personally, I see this as a theme for him, but again, you can argue that the terrain made his options limited. You combine these battles, though, and I think you get the picture that he doesn't have the best 1862 either. Now, you can also kind of point to, Carter Stevenson's division shows up, and that's able to free up additional troops. Carter Stevenson's division probably should have been with Braxton Bragg for Stones River. They probably would have done a better job there, or more service to the Confederacy there, right? But there is kind of the shuffling of troops, and the cavalry raids do pause Grant. And remember, we have kind of this, mostly by Grant, but you have these other efforts by Sherman as well. He's kind of on him with the same page, where we're going to go ahead and try all these different types of ways to get at Vicksburg, and then eventually they're going to find the right one. In 1863, Sherman will be heavily involved yet again in the attempts on Vicksburg. He would have a brief sojourn in joining John McClernand in his attempt on Arkansas Post. Remember, McClernand was trying to take control of a separate army, and lucky for Grant, Halleck is also going to dislike him. And not only that, he's going to dislike him probably more than Ulysses S. Grant. This is going to result in a restructure of the army, a 3-corps system that's going to include Sherman, McPherson, and McClernand all taking the reins. Grant famously has many attempts on Vicksburg, but finally settles on moving under the guns and then across the river. Sherman would be dispatched during these battles to deal with Jackson, which he will capture in mid-May. He'll go back to destroy part of that city in the future, showing his turn toward doing what is necessary to end the war. But here's the thing for me. He really is not involved in the battles leading up to Vicksburg. He misses Champion Hill, which is the largest battle of the campaign. His troops do participate on the later May assaults on Vicksburg, but they're going to be repulsed. Not to say Sherman might have done better, because his options are again limited, but again, he just kind of mashes his command on the narrow path, leading to a strong rebel work. Now, there's also kind of a back and forth that you could have, because there is kind of this thinking that post-Champion Hill, the Confederates are not going to have any sort of will to continue to fight, so an assault is going to work. That's one of the reasons why Grant is going to launch this general assault that eventually, like we said, is going to fail, but Sherman does not have any sort of big idea in terms of he's just going to advance in a column right down a road, and that's going to rack up some pretty heavy casualties. Grant will be disappointed by the failures of the attacks and settle on a siege. Sherman will be dispatched before the end of the affair to check Joe Johnson at Jackson once again. Having successfully subdued Mississippi, Sherman, along with Grant, are going to shift their attention to the relief efforts of Chattanooga. So the value in him as a subordinate is on full display here, that being that Grant is going to trust him. He's given the most important task in the assaults in trying to take out Tunnel Hill, which is on the flank of the Missionary Ridge line. Unfortunately for Sherman, Pat Claiborne is there to turn in a good performance and to deflect all these attacks that Sherman is going to launch. Sherman, once again, is not really a tactical genius in this engagement. It is kind of interesting. He doesn't actually use, and you could, again, there's always this kind of back and forth, right? There's all these, I would say, a little bit of an excuse train, a little bit with William T. Sherman, where, again, his options are limited. He doesn't really have the terrain and the capability to bring his superior numbers to bear, but Pat Claiborne certainly is going to show that he's a little bit more of a battlefield presence, of a battlefield leader, if you will, and, it's hard to say. Pat Claiborne is probably one of the better generals that the Confederates have in the subtheater of the war, but when he goes toe-to-toe with Sherman, he definitely wins here. 1863 is going to be the year for George Gordon Meade. While we have mentioned already the action at Gettysburg, we can also say that it starts at Chancellorsville. Meade is going to be commanding the 5th Corps and face a determined effort by Jackson to drive the Federals back into the wilderness. From there, parts of his command would do a good job in blunting the counterattack by rebel forces. Meade is going to form a good defensive perimeter that Hooker sets up in the wilderness. When Chancellorsville goes the wrong way for the Union forces, he's going to help secure the crossings of the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. Post-Chancellorsville, Meade is going to not be able to help himself in terms of not getting involved with the squabbles of the generals in the army. He did not like Hooker, and he was going to be very critical of him. And, for all we can say about Meade, he's not alone in that. There's a lot of people that don't particularly like Hooker, but he's going to be critical of not only Hooker, but also Burnside, right? So you have kind of this sort of weird area that Meade is in, where, Burnside, he's going to be a McClellan guy, right? And if you're in the McClellan coaching tree, if you will, for these generals, you're probably not going to want to burn that bridge. And then Hooker is kind of this new guy, and he has his own sort of set of individuals that are coming on board with him, and you're going to also burn that bridge. So it is a little bit perplexing by Meade. He just can't help himself. But he's going to be part of several generals who are going to complain to Washington. I have seen it thrown out that Meade could dish this same amount of whining, but he could not handle it when it comes on the other end. Hooker's days are going to be numbered. There were a good handful of generals on the short list for those who could take over for the Army of the Potomac. We've mentioned before Darius Couch and John Reynolds. There was even whispers that McClellan should be the one to take over again, but George Gordon Meade, having given a good combat record so far, is going to be tabbed. He was a good choice if you were trying to get out of the politics that had been plaguing the army. As mentioned, of course, Meade is kind of not in any of these political camps, right? He's not necessarily in one of these trees, and then he's not necessarily trying to align himself with a certain part of the government, as you have individuals like McClellan is certainly very staunchly Democrat, and you have Hooker who's trying to get involved in terms of these politics when he's commanding the army. So in that regard, Meade is going to be a good choice. Meade is going to reluctantly take over in the dire hour. Much has been written about his performance during the Gettysburg campaign. He originally wanted to set up a strong defensive position in Maryland, but once the contact is made in Pennsylvania, he's going to be doing a good job of reacting. Still getting to know the army, he would trust his subordinates. Several officers I have mentioned saved the Union Army. The first we have Buford, Reynolds, Howard, and Hancock, all taking the cake on the first day. Meade would do a good job in realizing by the third day that the strike is going to be in the center. And while he has little to shift to meet this threat, the lines hold, and he has the awareness to know not to counterattack, as that would have been foolhardy. But what can we really make of Gettysburg? Meade was on the defensive and constantly reacting to what Lee was doing. He does a good job of selecting terrain and then meeting threats, especially after Dan Sickles and his famous redeployment. Dan Sickles is another individual who's going to be on that list of those who claim they saved the Union Army. And actually, in a future episode, we're going to be talking about those individuals and maybe making a case for and against each. So stay tuned for that. Meade is not going to sparkle after the battle, and that's really going to be the big problem. Chasing Lee, it would seem that he has him cornered, but then he's going to allow him to escape. Now, you can understand, though, that a large amount of his troops were going to be militia, and the Army of the Potomac was quite depleted. So there is that. But he was too close to seeming like McClellan there for the Lincoln administration. Moving into Virginia, Meade would launch a campaign where he would show his indecisiveness. After some posturing, Meade would settle along the lines that were very close to where the two armies had actually started before the invasion of Pennsylvania. Stanton is going to be irritated with Meade, and there was a perceived weakness for him for calling a council of war at Gettysburg. With Grant showing up, it would seem that Meade was superfluous. He would offer to resign, but remain in his position. Part of this would be political. Meade was in fact a Democrat, and when his star was at its peak, there were some whispers of a presidential run. While he had certainly fallen slightly in stature, keeping him where he was in the army seemed prudent to the Republican administration. There's a lot of back and forth I've seen as well about this council of war that happens prior to, he actually does it multiple times, but actually certainly prior to the third day at Gettysburg, of what we should do, and there is a little bit of that I've seen when it comes to being a leader and making these connections as I have with other books and articles that I've read. Certainly there's a lot to analyze for this decision, and a lot of them sort of line up in the middle, where Meade is doing what a good leader should do. If we're talking about like maybe in an office setting and kind of in our business sense, he is actually trying to crowdsource these ideas. He's ultimately the one to make the decision, but he is asking these individuals. He's very unfamiliar with what's going on with the Army. He just took it over, right? And that's one of the things that we point out a lot, is that just because he had been a division, a corps commander, right, it doesn't mean that he knows these other people. A lot of times, and it might seem pretty wild, but maybe not for you, but for me it does. A lot of these guys just meet each other for the first time at certain points, and maybe even sometimes they meet each other for maybe the only time in certain situations. And this Council of War might have been one of them, where this is the first time we're seeing Meade. This is the first time we're actually meeting the guy. So it is very interesting in that regard, I think. And that is sort of the lenient view on Meade and his Council of War. Kind of the critical view, and the view that there are some contemporary sources that certainly jab at, is that Meade is then allowing the Council of War to dictate the decision, right? And then for a variety of reasons, that's probably something that would have been a problem, because it's not him making the decision, right? You know, he's the leader. He should be the one who's actually calling the shots. And then you also have on kind of the back burner, right? If things go wrong, he can then point the blame at somebody else. And certainly there are generals, there are members of the administration that are not going to like that, because you have seen that before, where it's certainly, we just had Hooker at Chancellorsville. He has this big three of people that he blames. Like, it's Stoneman's fault, it's Sedgwick's fault, it's Howard's fault. And you could then see why this Council of War maybe would have been, hey, it's John Gibbon's fault. John Gibbon told me that I should stay put. And, you know, that obviously that didn't work. So you kind of get it from both sides, where you can see the positives and the negatives. Now, Sherman is going to have the best body of work for him personally, certainly in 1864 through the end of the war. He's going to launch the Meridian Campaign, showing a little preview of his march to the sea. Atlanta is going to be on the wish list for Lincoln, and so with Grant moving on to the main stage, Sherman will become the primary subordinate and Army group leader in the sub-theater. A campaign of maneuver is going to make sure that he gets to the outskirts of Atlanta, with one real engagement, Kennesaw Mountain, a battle in which, yet again, he just bashes his command against a defensive-minded Confederate army. I think Sherman is also a benefit of the personnel he is up against. He will have the mostly defensive Johnson in the maneuver part of the campaign, which you could say is probably the right person to have during that period. It's not that Johnson doesn't try to have some sort of opportunistic victory, some sort of aggressive action. He doesn't get there, right? And so that is going to be the right personnel to face in that portion of moving to Atlanta. And then once he gets there, he has John Bell Hood, who's going to return the favor by attacking him in a string of battles outside the city. It's really going to see some uninspired assaults. Sherman will continue to maneuver Hood out of his defenses, capturing Atlanta in September. Now, I will also throw out there that while I have been negative to Sherman in terms of some of this analysis, there is something to be said of his avoiding a major battle that will rack up a lot of casualties. Grant is not avoiding contact at the same time in Virginia. Especially as the war progresses, mitigating losses would be important, and if anything, we can say that Sherman does have this kind of McClellan-like approach to the preservation of his men. So, we can also point to another individual that I hope to do an episode on in the future, and that's going to be William Stark Rosecrans. And I think he is actually very much underrated. It's really, Chickamauga is going to really kind of peel him into the bad general category, but he has this Tullahoma campaign, and that is going to be a campaign that gains a lot. It actually captures East Tennessee for Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln is going to be overjoyed because East Tennessee has been on his wish list for some time. So he has this essentially bloodless campaign. There's some skirmishes. There's not really a major battle at all. Some cavalry battles. But then he's going to actually gain all this territory, and we can point to that campaign and say, wow, that was actually a really good job. Well, why can't we point to the Atlanta campaign and say the same thing? So certainly you have that we can also put into the positive category for William T. Sherman. From Atlanta, we have the famous March to the Sea, which Sherman does, albeit sort of reluctantly. Again, he's on the same page as Grant and understands that a harder war is necessary to win the conflict. From Savannah, he will move up into the Carolinas, burning Columbia before moving on to North Carolina, fighting one of the final battles of the war at Bentonville. An encounter battle, something that Sherman had not seen a whole lot of, he's actually going to do a good job to contain rather than bulldoze Johnson. Bennett's place would see the largest surrender of rebels, Sherman delving a little too close into politics. So while you have kind of this same mindset as Grant that we need to do what it takes to end the war, you're going to have individuals like Stanton who are going to be like, whoa, not quite like that, buddy. Like, let's actually think this out and think about the things that we're putting down on paper in terms of accepting this surrender. It's going to be the Secretary of War that's going to be irritated at Sherman for it taking it upon himself to set terms. Remember, he had been criticized for his treatment of formerly enslaved individuals and enacted a policy of 40 acres and a mule that is actually going to be repealed later. In a kind of similar but opposite sense, Meade's 1864 is actually going to probably be one of his more frustrating. Grant would closely supervise him. The Wilderness would be a battle in which Grant would allow the various generals to operate without too much control of the situation. It would become apparent after that battle, though, that this is not going to be something that's going to jive with Grant's overall strategy. Thus, throughout the remainder of the campaign, it would be Grant's direction, and the performance of Meade would thus suffer. By the time we get to Petersburg, we have a pretty strong decline in Meade's actions. Crossing the James would see a lack of direction, and in a situation where Petersburg might have been seized and the war ended early by a couple months, we have a continuation of the conflict via siege. Meade would remain in his role throughout the siege, but he would sort of just be in the background. He would fail to realize the importance of additional forces at the crater, so we can say his performance was definitely subpar. We can be critical, but also sort of sympathetic to Meade. He definitely was in a tough situation. Moving him to the valley might have been an option, and it would have been interesting to see some redemption there, a la kind of an all-over Otis Howard, but it's going to be deemed too much of a step down for somebody who once led the army, and someone who was the hero of Gettysburg. Meade is not going to be present at Appomattox, which kind of shows you exactly what Grant is going to think of him. While Meade is actually going to retain kind of the logistical control for the army, he's going to sort of be handling that and executing the operation through what Grant has in mind in terms of overall strategy. It's just going to be not the best situation for somebody who does have a good combat record and had turned in some pretty good service. It's not going to be quite what he would have wanted. In the post-war years, the paths of Meade and Sherman are going to cross in 1869. Sherman would be promoted to be the general-in-chief of the army. He would pass over Meade in favor of Phil Sheridan, Meade lingering until his retirement. Sherman would be in control of the army for their wars against the Plain Indians, and would be criticized for his heavier-handed tactics against them and their displacement of their lands, especially as gold was discovered in the Black Hills. As we had mentioned, he was in camp that very much disagreed with racial equality. He would encourage the destruction of buffalo herds, which brought on hardships for tribes like the Sioux, who relied on the buffalo to survive. We'll probably cover those conflicts in a future episode, though. Sherman would continue to serve in the army, throwing out his memoirs about the war in the meantime. Kump would be tabbed at one point as a potential presidential nominee, but he would decline. Meade, on the other hand, would live relatively quietly in Philadelphia. He would receive an honorary law degree from Harvard in his post-war years. Both men are going to die of pneumonia, albeit years apart, Meade in 1872 and Sherman in 1891. So what conclusions can we make of these general officers? If we were to compare them, I think we had a strong argument for Meade being the better combat leader. Sherman, though, is definitely better in a campaign for maneuver. Now Meade was up against Lee, so definitely better quality opponent than Sherman is probably facing, but he does get the runaround post-Gettysburg and then back in Virginia. It's hard to think that while Sherman might not compare against Lee on the battlefield, that he would allow for Lee's escape post-Gettysburg, or allow for the rebels to run circles around him. Sherman's value, where Meade's declined, is definitely in the trust shown to him by Grant and his ability to be on the same page. At the top of the episode, we mentioned a similar aspect to the relationship with Lee and Jackson. Sherman realizes he needs to wage a harder war, and Grant agrees. They're pretty in tune with the war goals, the elimination of Lee's field army, and then the wearing down of the South, so they are not willing to continue the war once that happens. By the time Meade gets to the point where he is under Grant, there is no such partnership. That's probably some of that on Liss, and his dislike of officers from the Army of the Potomac that he sees as weaker. Probably yes, but Meade he did not trust. He sort of gets his chance at the Wilderness, but he does show little less than a great effort there. Charles Griffin famously blows up at Meade in front of Grant, which is not going to bode well for his perception. If you had an employee and your boss saw the employee start yelling at you and you just kind of taking it, then that's going to be an issue in the light of the individual who's your direct report, right? So that is kind of what happens at the Wilderness. Meade is going to very much complain about Phil Sheridan because Phil Sheridan is going to want to have cavalry operate in kind of this new fashion, and he's going to boast about how he can destroy Jeb Stuart, and taking away the cavalry from the army is probably not the best move at that time, but he does it anyway because Grant's going to allow him to, because he's going to be one of the individuals that he trusts, and Meade does not earn that trust. And that's some of that we can actually point back to Meade as being part of the problem. He doesn't actually get to that point where he's able to become a key subordinate for Grant. So while there are definitely some differences, I do actually see a lot of similarities for both generals. Both started at brigade level and performed well. Both had the benefit of fellow officers that aided in their rise through the ranks. Both attempted to stay out of politics, but were sort of unsuccessful. While Sherman is considered to be the primary lieutenant for Grant, Meade does serve in that capacity, and there's something to be said for him retaining command of the Army of the Potomac, where it had been sort of a revolving door. Because that's the other thing at the bottom line, right? If he really wasn't good at his job, and what he eventually ends up doing is probably not ideal for him in terms of his career, but if he really was not all that great at his job, then Grant probably could have very easily replaced him, right? Or at least he's not going to be able to do that because of the politics of things, but might have been able to maybe send him somewhere else, like John Pope certainly kind of gets the end of the short end of the stick. He gets shipped out to Minnesota following Second Manassas. Certainly there might have been something like that happens. So let's go ahead and call it a day right there. We have a good rundown of two subordinates to Grant and their performances. I think this one in particular gives us a good full picture of Sherman and Meade that maybe we did not get around to in the main narrative. Next week, we'll continue to look at analysis, this time by taking a look at the commanders of the subtheater for the Confederacy. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.